Hello everyone. Our focus in this episode will be on Jesus, the temple, mercy and prophetic critique. Now the purpose is not to prove that Jesus rejected sacrifice, but simply to investigate. So let's try and get a picture in our mind's eye, so to speak. See, why did Jesus repeatedly direct people towards mercy, to the heart, and to understanding? Also, an additional question would really be helpful. Have we sometimes confused the means with the purpose? Let me explain. Remember, Jesus warned, beware of false prophets. But he also said, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Now, why would Jesus say that? After all, the temple in Jerusalem, it actually revolved around sacrifice, did it not? See, animals were bought, animals were sold, animals were offered for sacrifice. Blood was shed. And yet, when Jesus entered the temple, what did he do? He overturned the money changer tables, railing against what he saw. But what exactly did he see? Well, Jesus saw the very thing we would see if we were there. So let's try and imagine the scene with a little help from archaeological excavations and indeed some calculations. See, excavations around Herod's temple have revealed a vast underground network of a drainage system that led into the Kidron Valley. It has also been discovered that on the altar platform there were two holes large enough for a young fit man to really enter. See, these holes, they led into and connected with the drainage network, and these two holes were in the southwest corner of the altar base, and they were known as the nostrils. Blood flowed from the sacrificed animals into these nostrils, merged into the channel, and ran out into the Kidron Valley. Now this was all plumbed into the system, mixing it with other sacrificial liquids like urine and offal, and exiting the Temple Mount underground and into the Kidron Valley. Now the centralization of worship in Jerusalem meant that all the blood was concentrated in one place, and that is why engineered channels were necessary. And it's also why the Jewish historian Josephus could say that 1.2 million animals were slaughtered in one day. Now, whether or not that figure is true, the system was certainly designed for a really high throughput. However, using a much lower estimate than Josephus, it could easily mean a volume of blood of about 65 bathtubs full that flowed into the nostrils in some 3 hours in the afternoon, preceding the Passover meal. Now that period was known as between the two evenings, and it was the designated time for the slaughtering of the animals. Now we find this instruction given for the first Passover just prior to the Exodus from Egypt. Exodus 12, verses 5 and 6. Your lamb must be an unblemished year-old male, and you may take it from the sheep or the goats. You must keep it until the 14th day of the month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel will slaughter the animals at twilight, that is between the two evenings. Because the Hebrews didn't count time in hours as we do. No, their day was divided into really 4 periods: morning, midday, evening, around 3 p.m. when the sun began to dip, and dusk, when the sun dropped below the horizon, twilight. Now let's continue with this in mind, processing the image that we are sort of trying to develop here. There was an entrance door to the courtyard that housed the altar and the tables where the animals were slaughtered. Priests would line up between the tables, this is in the courtyard, and the altar, and bowls would be used to collect the blood of the animals slaughtered on the tables. Now these bowls would be sort of passed along the line of priests to the altar where the blood was delivered into the nostrils to be carried away by the drainage system into the Kidron Valley. Now during festival times, the slaughtering process would be split into 3 groups, each in turn entering through the door to the courtyard after the others had completed their sacrifice. All this had to be accomplished in a matter of 2 to 3 hours. I mean, today's analogy of a production line really could fit that process, couldn't it? Incidentally, there was a 40-meter drop from the altar on the Temple Mount to the Kidron Valley. So the whole system was sort of gravity-fed. Skin, dung, and entrails were taken and burned outside the temple. Now, can you imagine the stench? The stench accompanying the frightened baying of the animals, sensing their death. That's what would have pervaded the air, the noise and the stench. Think of what the young priests would have had to cope with when assigned to, with the cleanup job, if you like, after the festival. See, is it any wonder God used the prophet Amos to deliver this scathing indictment? Amos chapter 5, 21 and 22. I despise your feasts. I cannot stand the stench of your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. For your peace offerings of fattened cattle, I have no regard. That's quite a strong indictment, isn't it? A pretty strong rebuke. Finally, on another point of note, the blood and other parts that were collected in the Kidron Valley were sold to the farmers as fertilizers. In fact, the entire economy of Jerusalem depended on the business of the temple sacrifices. It really was big business. Now let that thought settle. So, was he attacking the sacrifice itself? Was he exposing corruption? Or was he revealing something deeper that had been missed all along? See, because if we misunderstand that question, we may misunderstand the very thing Jesus wanted us to learn. So we do need to take account of what Jesus said in Matthew 7, 15 and 16. Let's read that. Beware of false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. The problem we have with false teachings is that it is not always obvious. See, often the greatest danger comes from ideas repeated so often inside the congregation that nobody stops to ask, is this actually what the scriptures say? And perhaps that is why Jesus also said in Matthew 9 and verse 13, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And Jesus here was quoting from the prophet Hosea, chapter 6 and verse 6. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. However, notice something very interesting. Jesus, he did not say, I desire mercy and reject sacrifice. Nor did he say, sacrifice has no place. Instead, he draws attention to priority. Mercy comes before sacrifice, relationship before ritual, heart before outward forms of service. And keep in mind, and also note, that by the time of Jesus, temple worship had evolved into, well, a huge system of buying animals, selling animals, offering animals, and other sacrifices, money changes, because all coinage had to be changed into the temple currency. Another good money-making scheme, I would hesitate to state. And these were not small matters. They touched on worship itself. See, so when Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers, we should ask carefully, really carefully, what was he challenging? The animal sacrifice? The commerce? The corruption? Or something even deeper? Because Jesus says that Matthew 21 and verse 13, and we find word for word repeats in Mark 11:17 and Luke 19:46. He says, "My house shall be called a house of prayer. You have made it a den of robbers." So the issue he identified directly was not blood. It was what the temple had become. But then this raises another question. See, if sacrifice was central to worship, when did sacrifice begin? Did it begin with Moses? Well, there is clear evidence from the tablets in Ashurbanipal's 7th century BC library at Nineveh, the Assyrian king, records of blood being applied on palace gates to protect against malevolent forces, to the lintels and thresholds and doorposts, to protect the royal residence of the king. Now, this closely parallels what we find in Exodus chapter 12, verses 12 and 13. Let's read that. "On that night I will pass through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn male, both man and beast, and I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood on the houses where you are staying will be a sign. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. No plague will fall on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." That was the first Passover. But here's a strange thing. Jesus never mentions this Exodus account or even refers to it. And keep this in mind, the scribes at Nineveh were copying material that went back to Sumerian and Old Babylonian times, the second and the early first millennium BCE. So which came first? Moses or the Assyrian practice? Well, we can't say, but there is strong evidence in historical documents that indicate this practice was widespread also in Egypt, this sacrifice, blood sacrifice. Therefore, Moses, being familiar with this, is really quite plausible, isn't it? Particularly since his ancestor Abraham came from where? From Mesopotamia, where all this was, these tablets were found. Now, what about the account of Abraham attempting to offer up his own son Isaac? Well, Genesis chapter 22, 10 and 12. Let's read that. "Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. 'Do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him,' said the angel. 'For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me.'" However, again, Jesus never mentions this account. Is this not somewhat strange? Particularly when the New Testament writers place so much emphasis on this account as the sort of parallel to the relationship between Jehovah God and Jesus. Now let's just reflect on that for a moment. And what about the blood sacrifice of Abel? Well, Genesis 4, 3 and 4. "So in the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruit of the soil as an offering to the Lord, while Abel brought the best portions of the flock." Now it's quite clear Abel seemed familiar with blood offerings. But the Genesis account provides no mention of any comment from God to engage in this sacrificial practice. And of course, Jesus once again makes no mention of Abel's sacrifice. But he did indeed mention all three persons as historical figures, but never in connection with blood sacrifices. So, is it not possible, even probable, that this practice originated with humanity and not with God? Therefore, an immediate question would be, why did humanity begin offering life at all? Now, that is where we go next. But remember, Jesus warned us to be aware of false prophets. Perhaps that warning begins with a simple instruction: go and learn what this means. So that is what I'm attempting to do, to explore, really, in this video series. Why did people begin sacrificial offerings of life at all? Because the Hebrew scriptures don't indicate this came from God. And the answer may affect how we understand worship, covenant, and even the teachings of Jesus himself. So let's begin with the book of Genesis, chapter 4 and verse 3. Cain, well, what does he do? He brings produce. In verse 4, Abel brings from his flock. The text, well, it tells us what they brought. But where did they learn to do this? Who instructed them as to what to do? The text never explicitly says God commanded sacrifice. Instead, sacrifice suddenly appears to be already happening. Now, that does not prove anything by itself, but it raises an important question, because the Bible, it often records events without stopping to explain their origin. For example, agriculture, it already existed. Cities already existed. Musical instruments already existed. And sacrifice appears to be in the same way. The text describes it, but it does not explain when it began. So perhaps we need to ask, are we reading assumptions into the story? See, in the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus, Israel certainly had sacrifices. But then the prophets later ask really difficult questions, like Hosea and Amos. Why? Because sacrifice itself was never meant to be the center of everything. So when Jesus says, go and learn what this means, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, he was doing something really important. He was not rejecting Scripture, but directing people back towards its purpose, the purpose of Scripture. So a question regarding the Hebrew Scriptures, well, how or when did sacrifice originate? And perhaps the next question is even more important. Even if sacrifice already existed, what was it actually for? Was it a solution to something? Or was it serving a different purpose altogether? And that takes us toward the next episode. But before that, let's summarize what we have already covered in this episode, in this video. The first point, Jesus warns us in Matthew 7:15 and 16 to be aware of false prophets, especially those within the congregation. The problem we have with false teachings is that they're not always obvious. And often the greatest danger comes from ideas repeated so often inside the congregation that nobody stops to ask, is this actually what the scriptures are saying or not saying? Second point. And that is why he cautions in Matthew 9:13 to go and learn what a scripture actually means and what it doesn't mean. You see, we need to be alert, really need to be alert to what we're actually reading, as we can so easily make assumptions based on our own private understandings. And then the third point, the whole temple arrangement had evolved into this giant business operation, built around income from blood sacrifices. And Jesus challenged the temple authorities, reminding them that the temple was a house of prayer, not a house of business. And Jesus demonstrated this by not once mentioning the three major occasions in the first two books of the Hebrew Scriptures. Never mention them. The blood offering of Abel, Genesis 4:1 and verse 3. The attempted sacrifice by Abraham of his son Isaac, Genesis 22 and verse 12. And the first Passover in Exodus 12:3 right through to 7. See, it would be difficult to argue against the understanding that blood sacrifices were not from God, but from human tradition. So the question remains, since all the major denominations in Christendom have their main doctrine, the saving of their souls, founded on the sacrificial body and blood of their Christ, is that a doctrine Jesus taught? Now, the next episode, we will investigate that very issue. It's entitled, Beware of False Prophets. What purpose did sacrifice actually serve? That'll be Series 9, S9E4, Beware of False Prophets. What purpose did sacrifice actually serve? So, once again, thank you very much for watching, and look forward to seeing you next time.